interviews and columns. Today's legit class is on need for speedy trial and procedure of Section 138 of the Negotiable Instruments Act by Mr. Rajat Mathur and Mr. Arjun Devan. We are privileged to have you here, Mr. Mathur and Mr. Devan. I will introduce you to our guest speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. Rajat Mathur. Mr. Mathur has done his BCom from the prestigious Sri Ram College of Commerce and his law from Faculty of Law, Delhi University. Mr. Mathur does litigation practice in Delhi. He works extensively on criminal, property, and revenue side and has represented bureaucrats in coal scam matters. Our next speaker is Mr. Arjun Devan. Mr. Devan is the founder of Devan and Company. Mr. Devan did his law from the famous Symbiosis Law School, Pune. Mr. Devan is practicing in trial courts and Delhi High Court for a period of about 10 years. After graduating, he joined the chambers of Rishikesh Barua and subsequently the chambers of former Additional Solicitor General Mr. Siddharth Luthra. Mr. Devan practices primarily criminal and property law. So before we start, let me just tell you that today we have a 45-minute session and 15 minutes of Q&A session, which we will be taking in the end. I would request everyone to be on mute for the entire session. If you have any question, just send them in the chat box and we will take them in the end. So I guess we are all set and I will hand over this legit class to Mr. Mathur now. Over to you, Mr. Mathur. Mr. Mathur, you are on mute. If you can unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Is the voice audible?
Yes, you're audible, Mr. Mathur.
Yeah, thank you. Just for the sake of convenience, me and Arjun have divided the lecture into 6 parts. The first part being the background of the Act, the second part being the statutory framework, the third part being the judicial pronouncement on the procedure and how to expedite the trial, fast trial. Fourth being the steps taken by the legislature on account of speedy trial. The fifth being the practical difficulties, and last topic being the suggestions and the way forward. For first 3 parts will be covered by me, and the remaining last 3, 4 to 6 will be covered by my colleague Arjun Devan. Just to start with the background, this act came into being on 1st of March 1882. For the sake of reference, as we can see from the preamble, the words referred are defined and amend and not consolidate, which means that the act is not an exhaustive act, and the act has to be read with other provisions of law and the statute. For example, with it has to be read with CRPC and the Law of Contract, Sale of Goods Act, just to have the mention. Thereafter, the preamble also talks about the fact that this act covers 3 aspects of the Negotiable Instruments Act. First being the promissory note, second being the bill of exchange, and third being the check. Check is also a form of a bill of exchange, as we can see from section 6 of the act. It starts with the language, section 6. A check is a bill of exchange drawn on a specified banker and not expressed to be payable otherwise than on demand, and it includes the electronic image of a truncated check and a check in the electronic form. Before going to the first 3 points, the background, the statutory framework, and the judicial pronouncements on specifically on the procedure and expediting the trial in this act, there are certain important concepts that can be kept in mind. First being the holder of a check. Holder of a check is dealt with under section 9 of the act, which means basically that a person having the possession and also the rights to enforce that instrument. Just for the correction, the holder is dealt with Section 8. Section 9 deals with holder in due course. Thereafter, the Section 13 deals with the meaning of a negotiable instrument, which means a negotiable instrument. It includes a promissory note, as we also dealt with in the preamble of the Act. Second, bill of exchange, and thirdly, the check, which is the subject matter of this discussion, which is payable either to order or to a bearer. So there are two categories to which this these three categories of negotiable instruments are addressed to. Thereafter, I will straight away come to section 138 to 148, which basically deals with the statutory framework. And just to start with the statutory framework, the policy, there's a reason why the Negotiable Instruments Act came into force. Around the time 1988, the legislature felt that certain steps needs to be taken to enhance the credibility of a check as an instrument of trade, and to promote the credibility in the commercial transactions and the business. Section 138 was introduced to criminalize the act or omission of the act of dishonor of a check, which is provided under Section 138, and thereafter the framework. Various case laws have been passed from time to time, and the ratio of all the case laws on the aspect of the policy are twofold. Firstly, the policy, the foremost policy objective is the compensatory aspect, and the second leg of the policy aspect is the punitive aspect. Time and again, courts have held that the compensatory aspect is much more important as compared to punitive aspect, and which is why in 2018, while referring to this ratio and giving precedence to the compensatory aspect policy objective of this act, the lead case of instruments and meters case by the Apex Court was passed, wherein it was held that the act of compounding of an offence under this section, under this act, can be passed at any stage, and much after the stage of the 251 CRPC, on the basis of which the cases cannot be compounded, except the aspect of the compounding. Now I will start with the first aspect, that is the background of the background. I have basically covered the first aspect, which is the background of the NI Act, which deals with the policy objective, and policy objective is the compensatory aspect, which is more important than the punitive aspect. The second aspect is the statutory framework. The statutory framework basically deals with section 138 to 148. The main section, main section is the 138, which deals with an act of dishonor of a check, which has been made a criminal offense. The framework goes like this. The framework goes like this: that from the date of the knowledge of the return memo, or the factum that the check has been dishonored, within 30 days, the complainant has to give a legal notice to the proposed accused person who had issued the check and which got bounced, and for some other reasons as specified. Thereafter, within 15 days, the accused has to either pay or despond, or else face the legal consequences. Thereafter, having failed to make the payment within the 30 days, thereafter, within 1 month, the accused, the complainant has to initiate the criminal complaint under this act. So which means that the time period goes like this: 30 days, 15 days, and 30 days. Thereafter, there are certain presumptions that have been provided in the act, which lean in favor of the complainant, which starts from section 118. It starts from clause A to G, providing for various presumptions like consideration, date, and so on, which means that to start with, the burden of proof, the initial burden of proof is on the complainant, in the form of the check being issued, the check being signed for a valid consideration. And once these presumptions are there, thereafter the burden of proof shifts onto the accused person to rebut and uh, uh, to come up with a plausible case in terms of this act. Thereafter, another presumption is section 139, which is also provided in the act, and also 140, which deals with the fact that the kind of defense which cannot be taken by the accused person. 139 deals with the presumption of a holder, as I just specified, section 8 of the act. Holder means uh, it shall be presumed, unless the contrary is proved, that the holder of a check received a check of the nature referred to in section 138 for the discharge in whole or in part, or any debt or other liability, which means that there is a presumption in favor of valid discharge, valid debt in favor of the complainant and against the accused. Section 40 is another presumption which deals with the fact that defense which may not be allowed in any prosecution under this act, which means the main offense of 138. Another presumption is provided in section 146, which deals with bank's prima facie, bank slip prima facie evidence of certain facts, which means that the bank's return memo stating the fact of dishonor is a prima facie evidence and fact to say that there's a presumption of fact of dishonor of such check, unless and until the such fact is disproved by the accused. These are certain presumptions. Thereafter, uh, the sections 141, 142, 142A, 143, 143A, 144, 145, 146, 147, 148. The clauses 142 to 145 start with non-obstante clause. That is the expression notwithstanding, which means that they have a supersession over the CRPC, and part of the reason is that the procedure is provided in this act under 143A is the summary trial procedure, and unless otherwise for reasons to be recorded, the magistrate thinks appropriate that the case needs a diversion and the case needs to be tried as a summons case trial. Now, the short procedure of this case, or I may say the trial as it happens under this act, is that on the first date when the complainant appears, the pre-summoning evidence takes place, which basically means that the complainant has to satisfy on the basis of the complaint and also on the basis of the documents annexed with the complaint that a prima facie case is made out on the basis of the checklist provided under section 138 proviso ABC, which are the foundational facts which needs to be satisfied on the first date. Once the court is satisfied that a prima facie case is made out, thereafter the court issues the summons. On the second date, when the accused appears, the the procedure which ought to be followed in a summary trial procedure, which is provided under section 260 to 265, is that the court has to examine the accused under section 260 263G. Thereafter, the court has to give a finding on that examination oblique plea of the accused, which is given under section 263H. Thereafter, if the court is satisfied that a prima facie case is made out, then court issues the notice, which is equivalent to framing of charge under section 251 CRPC, which comes under the category of summons trial procedure 251 to 259 CRPC. Thereafter, as strictly going by the summary trial procedure, the court has to record the plea of defense of the accused, and in the absence of any plea of defense, simpliciter, meaning thereby that if the accused simply says that I plead guilty without giving any reasons, then the court is mandated as per summary trial procedure to fix a date for the defense evidence and thereafter for the judgment. However, in case the accused comes up with a plausible plea and the court is satisfied, then in terms of the summary trial procedure, the accused has to, on the same date, be ready with an application under section 145(2) to cross-examine the complainant there and then, and court finding reasons which are cogent mentioned in the application may allow that application for recall of the complainant for the purposes of cross-examination. This stage and this application on the second day, on the second appearance or second date of the case is important for the reason that the summary trial procedure does not envisage recalling of a witness oblique complainant, whereas for this divergence, the court has to pass a speaking order specifying this divergence, and if the application is allowed for the recall, then the summary trial procedure converts into summons trial procedure, meaning thereby that the accused can cross-examine the complainant. Thereafter, after the cross-examination, the accused has to after the cross-examination, the complainant evidence is closed. Thereafter, the statement of the accused under 313 is taken. Thereafter, if the accused wants to lead the evidence, then the defense evidence takes place, and thereafter the final arguments and the judgment. Now, the provisions 144 deals with the summons. My colleague Arjun will deal with that in extenso, because the issue of summons is a problematic area wherein the summons are not effective, not reached, do not reach the accused person in time, or what are the modes of service. 143A is again the emphasis of the legislature in the summary trial procedure, which was brought by 2018 amendment. 145 is also an important provision which deals with the taking on record the affidavit as opposed to chief examination of the complainant, being a summary trial procedure. So as per settled proposition that the affidavit is akin to chief examination, and therefore the 145(2) is also important. 146, as I've dealt with, that prima facie presumption in favor of the return memo slip for a dishonour of check. 147 is compoundable, that the cases under 147 are compoundable. Specifically, my learned colleague Arjun will deal with this, that the aspect of compounding has been even allowed post the stage of 251 CRPC by use of the expression under section 143A as far as may be, which means that the compounding has been allowed in the case of meters and instrument 2018, even post the stage of 251, whereas there is no case of a discharge after 251 CRPC as has been held till date, being a summary trial procedure. Therefore, the scope of discharge is not possible under summary trial procedure. The last topic being the judicial pronouncements on the procedure and expediting fast trial. The main judgment started on this aspect from the Bombay High Court 2005 by the name of Chandra Biani versus Stock Holdings, Corporation. This is a 2005 Bombay High Court judgment which deals with at paras 5 and 7 the procedure strictly on the lines of summary trial procedure, as I just discussed. This was followed up in division bench of again Bombay High Court at para 38 and 39 with the name KSL and Industries versus Mannalal Khandelwal. This Bombay High Court judgment division was followed in Rajesh Agarwal 2010 Delhi High Court judgment, wherein at para 1, 7, 8, 10 to 12 and 17, and finally the para number 17 lays down the guidelines as to on day 1 or day 2nd, day 3rd, what a procedure needs to be highlighted. As just for the just to avoid repetition, the procedure, as I just discussed, strictly on the lines of summary trial procedure, has been discussed and followed by Rajesh Agarwal. Rajesh Agarwal was further followed up in 2013 Karnataka High Court judgment, which again dealt with the procedure to be followed strictly on the lines of summary trial procedure. Uh, and the and going by the Supreme Court judgments, 2014-2010 is Damodar judgment of Supreme Court, which deals with the how to expedite the procedure, how to serve summons, in what manner, what is the terminology of the summons to be served, and how to expedite the case. Thereafter, in 2014, the Indian Banks case, Bank Association case of 2014, Volume 5, SEC 590, which again dealt with the speedy trial and the correct procedure to be followed in case of Negotiable Instruments Act. Thereafter, in 2018, the Meters and Instruments case, 2018 Volume 1, SEC 560, the Supreme Court carving out a window specifically for the cases which can be compounded at any stage by referring to the interpretation of the expression as far as may be under section 143A, by saying that notwithstanding the stage of 251 CRPC, the cases can be settled, the accused can be discharged in cases of compounding, uh, uh, meaning thereby that the primary policy objective of the Negotiable Instruments Act, which is the compensatory aspect, was given preference to the punitive aspect, which is also the second leg of the policy aspect, but compensatory aspect was upheld and stated that the wherever possible cases can be settled at any stage of the case, they should be settled. Thereafter, these case laws have been followed up from time to time, and recently in Supreme Court 2020, in the case of Surendra Singh, sorry, in the case of there's a suo moto case which was picked up by the Supreme Court in 2020, wherein the issue of expeditious trial of the cases under this act is taken into consideration, and the few lawyers have been appointed amicus curiae, one being Mr. Siddharth Luthra, senior advocate, and uh, the court has requested Mr. Luthra to come up with the procedures wherein the cases can be expedited, especially on the aspects of the summons, on the aspect of section 202 CRPC, wherein the different and divergent views have been taken by different high courts and few others, primarily with the aspect because in the Indian Bank Association case, the timeline for the disposal of the cases was 6 months, which has not been followed. And even our Delhi High Court have gone on to the extent and passing orders on the administrative side to have some sort of time limit for expediting cases under this act. But till date, we are not able to achieve the main objective by section 138 was brought on the statute book, but hopefully this aspect would be resolved soon. And so I've done the first three aspects: the background of the act, the second is the statutory framework, and third being the judicial pronouncements on procedure and expediting fast trial. the last three topics in sequence, the fourth being steps taken by the legislature for speedy trial, fifth being practical difficulties, and last being the suggestions and the way forward. My colleague Arjun Diwan will take over now to conclude the aspects in issue.
Hi. So Mr. Mathur has quite literally explained as to the statutory framework regarding the 138 cases. Now, going by it, fourth heading that we're addressing is steps taken by the legislature for a speedy trial. I must say, ordinarily, we have a lot of difficulties with the legislature not coming up with appropriate legislations or appropriately worded legislation, leading to a larger scale of litigation than it was actually sought to try to minimize itself. Negotiable Instruments Act is one such legislation, if I could say so, which does not, which the legislature has in its own right, did its best to make and enforce check on other negotiable instruments and to achieve the very objective of the act. Three critical years in the history of this legislation, 2002, 2015, and 2018, there were amendments being brought about. All these amendments were focused on two aspects. One, somehow create a more speedy mechanism. B, create a more victim-friendly legislation. C, also ensure an expeditious disposal, which is good not only for the victim and for the accused, but also for the overall health of our judicial system. Now, if I could briefly say what happened in 2002 and 2015 and 18 respectively, is in 2002, a very important set of amendment was brought in, where section 143 to 147 was inserted by way of the amendment. Now, what is 143 to 147? Briefly put, 143 sets out that the case will be tried in a summary manner. As Mr. Mathur had already explained, that ordinarily a case should, under 138, for a prosecution under 138, should be followed by a summary trial. But in real difficulty, actually, the trials that is more or less followed by the trial courts, unfortunately, is a summons trial. Now, 143 is an interesting provision. It specifically directed the courts to follow the summary trial. Now, unfortunately, the same has not been taken forward in the manner as deemed fit, as desired by the legislature. Now, in 143, also by going to the summary trial, the legislature was of opinion to cut short the time period required for the purposes of recording evidence, etc., which is ordinarily very cumbersome in a trial. Now, that was the intent to take away the summons trial and put it into a summary trial. The courts also, the legislature also gave the liberty to the courts to actually choose their own procedure depending certain consideration that arises to whether to offer a summons procedure or whether to offer a summary trial. But practically what we have faced, and most of the lawyers will agree, that courts have by and large proceed only under the summons trial. Though that amendment was brought about, but has not achieved that result which was desired by them. The second provision that was inserted by this amendment was section 144. Under 144, mode of service of summons was prescribed. Now, this is ordinarily not required in the legislation, but a very important subsection 2 was introduced. And subsection 2 was introduced to actually say that even if a accused or a witness refuses service, the court may presume service and proceed further. This was done to reduce the timeline faced in the execution of service of the notice to the accused person. The court also expanded the definition under 144(1) to serve an accused on any place where he can work or resides or does anything for gain. This language is very similar to language that will be found under under the CPC. Another section that was brought in about was section 145. Section 145 is something which is unknown to criminal law prior to this legislation, and according to me. 145 gives the power of the court to take evidence on affidavits in criminal law. Just to make it my point more clearer, ordinarily an evidence in a criminal case follows by examination in chief and then followed by cross-examination. What the courts permitted by this is that for the purpose of examination in chief, you please file an affidavit instead of coming to the court, physically recording and consuming so much time. Please file an affidavit and we'll proceed with that from that affidavit. This is very similar to what happens in the civil procedure while suits are being tried. So this was unlike any other criminal legislation that I have come across. This is the first one which actually introduced such a provision. The Supreme Court later interpreted it to also say that even complainants' witnesses and accused witnesses can also give, except accused witnesses can also give evidence in affidavit. The underlying idea was to cut short the time taken to record examination in chief and henceforth. The next section that was introduced by this amendment of 2002 was that bank slip was prima facie evidence of certain facts. As you know, no court is allowed to draw a presumption. Presumptions are provided by the law. Under the Evidence Act, or as my learned friend pointed out, under 139 in the Negotiable Instrument Act, there's a presumption that there's a check has been issued towards a legal liability. Under 146, it was presumed that the bank slip of dishonor will be deemed to be good enough to be dishonor until it's disproved. So all I have to do is produce a receipt of dishonor, and then I don't need to prove anything further as a complainant to show that the check got dishonored. Under 147, one of the more sections that was introduced was that they made the offense compoundable, a much needed measure according to all of us to compound these offenses, because more or less these offenses are technical in nature. Mens rea may not be the real, mens rea is not to be found as an ingredient under this offense. So thus, it was permitted to be compounded to resolve a large scale of litigation. The next amendment that came was in 2015. This amendment was a follow-up of some judicial pronouncements regarding the territorial jurisdiction of the courts. Where should that case be filed in case a check is dishonored? The courts had held it that it could there's a judgment which came out that where the check got dishonored, that is the check at the place where the accused maintains the account. This was completely contrary to what the intent of the legislation was, to make it very victim friendly and to further the purpose of the sanctity to the checks. Now once this aspect was dealt with, So the next aspect in 2015 amendment was that they got the territorial jurisdiction back to where the complainant's bank account would be, and removed the substratum of the decision, reasons of the decision which were led to the decision by the Honorable Supreme Court. Now the other aspect that was dealt with, the 2018 amendment, which is a very recent amendment, was a critical amendment. It came out with two provisions. One is section 143 capital A, and then was section 148. Now what was happening in let's examine briefly the intent. The intent was that what was happening is that any person accused of an offense of under section 138 for check dishonor would come to court and would take any board plea in the court and proceed to go for trial. And it's been widely reported as to how long these trials have been taken to conclude. So what the legislature intended to do was, unlike in any other statute that you would find this, the minute you plead not guilty at the stage of 1251, the court has liberty to give an interim compensation, which could be later recoverable in given circumstances, to the complainant, ranging from up to 20%. This understanding was that it will deter more people from taking frivolous pleas and rather propound the idea of coming to court with clean hands and seeking compounding at the very instant rather than dragging the trial. Similarly, the other section that was brought in by this amendment was section 148. What the said amendment did was, it said that even once you file an appeal against an order of conviction or a judgment of conviction, then the appellate court could impose above 20% any amount to be deposited for entertainment of such appeal. Now, this section also deters people from filing appeals frivolously when the case or the judgment, there is no error apparent in the judgment of the trial court. The Supreme Court also, rightfully in my opinion, also brought in that while this amendment was introduced, all those cases which were pending appeal before the concerned court, those cases can be considered for award of such compensation fine to be provided during the pendency of the appeal. These are steps that legislature took in order to expedite trial. There is no saying as to it is the duty of the legislature to ensure that there is a speedy trial. Speedy trial, unlike the US Constitution, where in the Sixth Amendment, a speedy and a public trial has been duly recorded and noted in written text. In our Constitution, it's nowhere to be found. However, the court from Hasina Khatun's case and other cases have time and again interpreted that Article 21 implies a speedy trial. So in my opinion, and to what I understand of the legislation, is that the legislation has done its best. Legislation has done its best so far as enacting law to make it a more user-friendly and more victim-friendly and an expeditious trial disposal. Now, unfortunately, what is the intent of the legislature has really not culminated into what is happening in the courts. Like my learned friend pointed out the case which is pending consideration before the Supreme Court. In that case, only it was noted that there are 35 lakh cases, 3.5 million cases pending in India regarding pending trial, out of which 15 lakh are pending only in district courts, magisterial courts, which shows that trials itself for 15 lakh cases, 1.5 million were pending in India. This is I'm sure that the number would increase when more scrutiny of pendency of the cases is being examined. Out of this, the court also noted, and which is surprising, quite surprising a figure, 1.8 million, 18 lakh cases were pending for appearance of accused persons. So what does that imply? That implies that after issuing summons, the accused has not appeared in 18 lakh cases, and the court has to deal with such cases. It is this aspect which has led to, I believe, the recent issue also being highlighted is what to do with this legislation, and comments have been invited by the Finance Ministry, if I'm correct, to see what is done with legislation, because this is overburdening of courts. Now, what has led to this overburdening is something that I would point out, in my experience, what we have come across as to what is leading to this aspect. As the last statistic that I quoted from the Journal of the Supreme Court, the most important aspect is service. Now, service of summons has become a big issue in our country because unfortunately it's very easy to evade service for whatever reasons. What is happening today is when you go to a court, you file a case, the court is very prompt to issue summons. The date is listed in details from my experience. Allows your pre-summoning evidence to proceed and issue summons, and gives you a date up to 2 to 3 months depending on a court's calendar. Now, after that 2 to 3 months is ordinarily a procedure where you expect the accused to be served, you expect the accused to come ready with the directions passed in Justice Dhingra's judgment regarding how the next date will follow. Unfortunately, what's happening is when you go to there, you don't find accused coming for months, years. There is a procedure has to be followed regarding how do you go from summons to bail. That's another aspect which we leave it for the time being. But the difficulty that arises is the courts are reluctant to accept their affidavits of attempting to personally serve it. What we could do in this regard is to ensure that every district court ensures that a district-wise service mechanism is being set up, especially for 138 cases. I think it's a principal requirement that for 138 cases, a complete branch for service and process serving is being set up, which is in coordination right from the banks to the advocates to police officials who have been entrusted with the duty to serve it, and by the very staff it is. What the court could also ensure is that between the interregnum period, between issuing summons and the date of appearance, the court accused is fixed, the advocates of the complainant are notified as to the status of service. As on date, what happens is your service report reaches the court probably a day in advance. So what happens is when you go to the court on the date, only a day before the service report has come to the court, that there was no service effect. Now, in order to streamline the process, this information must reach the advocate as soon as it has reached the court. So the advocate within that same period can actually try and ensure another mode of service so that his date and period is certain months are not being lost. That's one aspect. The second aspect is, of course, which is something which it's a larger issue for the entire judiciary, not just in 138 cases, is to have separate courts for 138. Now, if you would go around the district courts of Delhi, you will find a lot of magisterial courts saying NI Act 01 or NI Act 02. Though these courts have been designated to be courts under Negotiable Instruments Act, but unfortunately, they are still dealing with ordinary offences which a magistrate deals. So they are not dedicated courts to 138 courts, which simply will have a streamlined process for 138 and their staff is also completely trained for 138 prosecution. Now, we could do best to ensure that the courts are completely relevant for 138 and no other work is entrusted on such presiding officers. I give you an example. Sometimes I have moved applications regarding delay in my cases. The courts have dismissed those applications, citing pendency of 8,000 negotiable instrument cases in those. Now, these numbers you can't expect any judge, any human to overcome with more piling on an every daily basis. So, according to me, this aspect also needs to be dealt with. The third aspect is there is a little innovative in terms of that would require a judicial precedent, which right now is to the contrary, or a legislative intervention. We don't have consolidation of cases now in 138 cases. Now, for example, there is a ex-person who had a case with bank. Now, the bank had 6 of its checks which got dishonored. Now, what the bank ordinarily does is it files 6 separate cases. In my opinion, there should be a mechanism being set out that certain cases which are falling in the same transaction, which is a language ordinarily found under the CRPC, should be all, especially under 138, should be tried together. If you tomorrow go to any district court, you look at its 138 courts cause list, you will see India Bulls versus X, A versus Y, same party, 8 different cases, different checks. So certain mechanism has to be set up to ensure that these cases are consolidated, though the punishment can be awarded separately. However, the trial should run, one trial should run, which will help the court to maintain only one judicial file and maintain one record of proceedings rather than numerous for the same transaction. This is one aspect. Now, let me go to the third aspect is personal appearance of the accused. Now, personal appearance of the accused has become quite an issue as pointed out on the service itself. Now, what we can do is dispense personal appearance and make it easier for personal appearance to be dispensed. What happens is a lot of times dates are being taken for the purpose of the unavailability of the accused person to come to the court. Now, though you can take exemption and courts are generally liberal enough to grant exemptions. But what this stops is certain aspects of trial are ideally to be conducted before the court, in the presence of the accused. Now, what courts should do is ideally in 138 cases, you should be, the minute the bail is obtained, which is requirement, after that, there should be no requirement for him to appear at all, and his authority, which is the advocate on record, should be allowed to continue the prosecution or defense without any further requirement of them to be in appearance. This will help the person to do other works, etc., and also ensure that the courts are not overburdened with trying to ensure appearances of the accused person when that is not the case. Now, going back to the service issue that we have, there have been very interesting judicial pronouncements that have taken place. My friend has dealt with some, if I may point out a couple of them. The Delhi dealt with an issue in HDFC versus Amit Kumar Singh, the 2009 decision, which set out as to what will amount to service in law. It said that as long as you have, I'll briefly put it without quoting it, as long as you have taken steps, issued it to the right address or the last known address, the court should presume service and proceed. Similarly, another judgment has come which says account, house lock, addressee not available, all of them should be taken as service being accepted. Another very interesting judgment has been given by the Supreme Court, which I think is most interesting of the lot is, in an event, as my learned friend pointed out, that during the prosecution under 138, there's a prerequisite of issuing a demand notice. So that demand notice, look, sometimes there's a lot of debate about what happens when the demand notice gets served or not gets served. Supreme Court in a decision, C.C. Haji Alvi, took a very different approach, and I would say a great approach, is that though maybe in a case the notice was not served properly, but in given circumstances, the court can treat the summon itself as a demand notice, and the accused will be entitled to pay up within that period 15 days from the receipt of the summon. So what this does is, it reduces the burden on the victim and the courts to ensure whether the service happened correctly or it didn't happen. Because if an objection to that degree has been taken up, it can be met with a very simple idea that you had the occasion to pay up once the summons were being served to you within 15 days. Now the third aspect is a very large amount of litigation has ensued in this country, and especially Delhi that we witnessed, is that under 141, there is a vicarious liability that has been fastened upon directors and officers or secretary or managers of the firm company, which has led to what is called unwarranted litigation, if I would say so. Like today, if any person is suing a check for a check disorder of a company, they land up suing each and every director which is named in the company. Now, what has that led to is led to a series of litigation before the High Court, challenging the order summoning such directors. What results in that is that ordinarily such directors should not be prosecuted. The complainant does not require them to be prosecuted to bring home his case. They were not necessarily in stricto sensu for him to prove his case. The matter reaches the High Court, and ordinarily High Court, finding some merit in such arguments, grants stay to the entire proceedings. So what is happening is, today's time, if there is a vicarious liability issue which unnecessarily some director is sought to be pressurized by way of this litigation, the High Courts have interdicted with the proceedings, which has led to further delay as the proceedings have been stayed. We should have ordinarily limited the challenge to the High Court in only limited circumstances, such as circumstances relating to not only merits, but issue on the vicarious liability, issue on defect in jurisdiction. But in today's time, with due respect to the High Courts have also entertained matters relating to the merits of the case, which time and again, the High Courts and the Supreme Court themselves have expressed to be a jurisdiction, an issue not to be discussed or adjudicated in writ or jurisdiction under Section 482 CRPC. So we would believe that it would help a lot, it will go a long way if the courts actually decide to do this. Another quick point that I'll point out is the courts have also, the Supreme Court has also taken a note of the fact that accused persons come and take frivolous defenses. So in order that this check was issued for security, this check was a blank check, or check taken by coercion, etc., etc. So the Supreme Court has asked the RBI, which I think is a great step if we can take it forward, is that we should actually have a check performer to show what was the purpose of the check, which required this aspect. Now, these are some of the practical difficulties that we are facing is frivolous, if I could sum it up as frivolous defenses, which are not being able to nip in the bud at this very start. B, extreme delay in execution of service by courts, with due respect to them, not enough mechanism being set forth. Third, setting up completely exclusive courts for 138. Fourth, ensuring that the steps taken by the legislature, such as example, the amendment of 2018 introducing compensation, are exercised with an iron hand. Like, in my opinion, every case of 138 which arises from a written contract should be exercised the maximum imposed compensation, 20% at the stage of trial, 100% at the stage of appellate remedy. So unnecessarily defenses are not taken forward, and proceedings are not dragged on just to buy time, that on X particular date you will settle the proceeding. So these are by and large the issues that we have faced. And now the last aspect on this, briefly on this aspect, is how do we go forward on this? As pointed out, the principal issue that we can go forward is completely revamping our infrastructure as to how we will proceed in 138 cases. Right from the judicial officers presiding over it, they should be sensitized, trained specifically for 138, should be reminded with due respect regarding the aspect of how trials have to be essentially be summarily in nature and not by summons. Thirdly, we should also set up a very interactive system between the lawyers and the judicial branches which proceed with the case, which can actually expedite it. Next, which has now been recently recognized in the Supreme Court also, is to ensure service by electronic modes. You can today evade service by saying that I'm not at home, or pay X person to not accept service, but you can't avoid an email coming into your box. You have no reason to do so, or a WhatsApp message, or in any manner. So the court should be proactive in ensuring electronic evidence and take it further from that. Another suggestion which will be that we can take forward is information being shared by the banks, the latest up-to-date details of the accused, which is also been again noted by the Supreme Court, to the complainant. What I mean by this is, today's time we find it difficult to actually know where the accused person is residing, or where does his residence is, where will I actually find him for service. So the banks being having a very high requirement of a KYC as we know your customer, have all the requisite details available to them. So why can't they, when on a dishonor of the check, the banks by and large on their own accord, along with the dishonor memo, should forward the brief details of KYC, not encroaching on any private space, but relevant for the prosecution under 138, forward it to the complainant, which the complainant can append to his complaint and take it from there. Another aspect that we can do is there is an interesting provision that in electronic check the bank will be taking responsibility to see whether the check is original or not being forged or truncated, etc. Same aspect can be examined at the bank level itself, whether there was any issue in the the clearance of the check, whether any issue was being highlighted while the check was being processed as to regarding the veracity or the genuineness of the check. If it is completely clean, which ordinarily it should be when every time it is being presented and passed, a certificate to that effect can also be provided. One more suggestion regarding is to my fellow advocates. When we decide to take up pleas, which we know in the longer run will never manage to survive in the trial, it is a plea to take up for the time to buy time for your clients. In such times, rather than actually buying time for your client to pay up at a later date, we should directly and be upfront with the court regarding what is the status of our financial health position and how can the court allow the compounding of the offense in a more restructured manner, which the courts have been very kind enough to do it in the past. So broadly, these are my suggestions, or rather our suggestions, regarding how we can take it forward from here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Devan, and thank you so much, Mr. Mathur. It was quite a knowledgeable session. So we have few questions lined up, and let's just take them one by one. So the first question is, where is the jurisdiction of the Section 138 case? The drawer's place or the drawee place?
So the jurisdiction, if I could answer, the jurisdiction is where the drawee, where the receiver of the check, the holder of the check, as his bank, is the place where the jurisdiction of the territorial jurisdiction of the court will lie, district court will be lie, in whose district the victims or the complainant's bank was there, where the check was being.
Okay, thank you. The next question is there any remedy after the mandatory time of 75 days to file the complaint before the court?
Yes, there is a remedy. If you proceed the timeline, there is actually 142P proviso, which was introduced by an amendment of 2002, specifically empowered the court to actually condone delay in given circumstances. Though I must point out in 138 cases, the court are reluctant to easily condone delay. But yes, the provision does remain for the courts to do it. That provision is only for the purpose of the complaint, not for the purpose of the demand. I must point out.
Thank you, Mr. Devan. Mr. Mathur, would you like to add something?
Yeah, he just pointed out on the aspect of the proviso to 142(1). The same has been on the aspect of the person has to show the sufficient cause on the lines of Section 5 of the Limitation Act. If his excuse falls in the expression sufficient cause, then that can be permitted.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what are your views on decriminalization of check dishonor cases proposed by the center? Do you really think Section 138 should be decriminalized?
In my view, the solution does not lie on the aspect of decriminalization. I think the procedure needs to be expedited, as my learned friend pointed out, that the various roadblocks need to be vacated, like on the first and the second date, primarily on the issuance of summons, the presence of the accused, and also to declog the remedy of the High Court, which more often than not, as very exhaustively pointed out by my colleague, that on every post facto defense of the accused person, the person comes to the High Court by quoting Adalat Prasad that since the MM cannot recall its summon, therefore I have to come to High Court. I think that the remedy is misconceived, because the summoning ought to be challenged on the ground of the complaint and the documents annexed with the complaint, and not on the basis of the defenses which might be taken by the accused. So, the issue of summons, the issue of the presence of the accused, the issue of I think also I would like to add that the issue of the Section 202 preliminary inquiry also needs to be taken care of, because there are different views of the high courts. Bombay High Court has in 2010 has taken a view that Section 202 is non-mandatory. Karnataka High Court has taken a balanced view that in certain situation 202 may be permitted. For example, in a case wherein the director had resigned prior to the issuance of the check, and still he was being summoned, and there's a need for the to to call for the records of the forms like Article 32. So on limited ground, it should be allowed. And again, again in a different view, 2019 Bombay High Court again has taken a view, single judge, that the issue of Section 202 is mandatory, as is the case in IPC offenses. So I think various roadblocks are there, and I think also strictly going by the procedure of summary trial procedure, if that is followed, and also the High Court remedies blocked unnecessary through frivolous litigation, I think we can achieve the objective, as my learned friend pointed out very in extensive.
May I also add one more thing to what my learned friend has said on this aspect? Decriminalization. When we say decriminalization, we are taking away again adjudication from the court. The idea of making this legislation itself was to make check a more alternate payment mechanism which has sanctity. The more you decriminalize it, in today's time where we are actually in a pandemic, you're actually going to take away substance of an instrument which today at least holds some water today and holds some deterrence effect before you issue it, or is required in the trade. Also, over-tribunalization and taking away powers of the court to adjudicate is not the way forward when it comes to today. It looks good for a limited cause, but when the rights of the accused start getting violated, it will be very difficult to address those aspects at that point.
Okay, thank you so much. Next question that we have is, which is quite an interesting one. In a check bounce case, what are the defenses available for an accused?
Various defenses can be on the point of limitation. For example, the legal notice was not served, as I just pointed out, the timeline of 30, 15, and 30 days. Secondly, can be on the aspect of the proviso to 142(1). The second line of defense can be on the point of jurisdiction, which my learned friend also dealt with in terms of 142, 1 and 2 clauses. And third can be on the point of vicarious liability. In number of cases, we find that either in a case of company, the accused is arraigned as an accused and not the company. So the law is quite in detail dealt with in Anil Hada case 2000 volume 1 SCC 1, wherein the use of the expression as well as the company in 141 subclause 2 very clearly states that the impleadment of the accused company is mandatory, in addition to the officers of the company which satisfy the test of 141 subclause 1 and 2, to say that they had specific role, they had were party to the connivance and everything as specified. So I think these three category of defenses can be taken: the limitation, the jurisdiction, and the vicarious liability. And I think my learned friend can add something on it.
Yeah, apart from it, one of the principal defenses that you can take is regarding the aspect of how the liability is. Whether there is a legal liability towards a rent, which is a defense which is quite commonly found to be. And one of the most magic words that are used by defense lawyers is security check. That it's a security check and we will use it for, that it was given for a security and not a liability existing on the date of when the check was dishonored. By and large, as an accused being responsible to dislodge the presumption. It's for you to show how the liability that the complainant claims is not existing in the manner as stated. As long as you dislodge it even with some probability, you can get around it. What may be your defense? But defenses of very high degree, such as forgery, alteration, etc., are defenses which are very difficult to prove, and thus should be seldom relied until it's actually being the case. Also, people take defenses of that I only handed over a blank check and the blank check was filled in by the complainant, everything, etc. Sometimes we people forget that there is a provision under the NI Act which specifically empowers to stamp, or what you call inchoate understand instruments, is to fill up the instrument. So when you give a person a blank check, you also give him the authority to fill up that check and take it forward. Considering that, it's ideally, as my learned friend pointed out, it's a technical offense. You want to take as many technical defenses as possible, but by and large, you have to also meet that there was no legal liability.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sure.
And just to finish everything, the accused has to take all these defenses at the first possible opportunity and not afterwards, and also do very wise and very perspective cross-examination, because overdoing cross-examination is also you are cutting your own legs by doing unnecessary cross-examination. So I think use of cross-examination as a tool is also very important and has to be used very sparingly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mathur and Mr. Diwan. Our next question is, if after every possible effort, the accused doesn't appear before the court, what can be done to bring the accused before the court?
So that's a pretty hard one to say as to what should be done to bring the accused home. But what ideally, the steps that is required to be taken is, if you are unable to actually make the person appear in the court, then the trial will stop for the time being, and it will be adjourned sine die, as we say, till the time the accused can't be produced. Now, what steps can you take? The steps you can take is, one is a critical information that we can get is from the banks as required. You can move application to the court, exercising its power. If today, as of today, if it's not available to you, move an application to the court to direct the bank of the concerned accused to provide the recent details, up-to-date KYC information that may bring you the correct addresses if it is not found there. There is a procedure of how the court has to proceed. Once it's issued summons, if the person is found to be deemed to be served even, it goes to a bailable warrant and then goes to a non-bailable warrant. All this requires one pertinent aspect, is to find where the accused is placed. And for this, according to me, the most critical person where the information can today be provided is from statutory or government bodies. And you should move appropriate application before you actually get your case being adjourned sine die, to get that information from statutory authorities to facilitate the court actually to try an offender before it.
Yeah, just to add what he has said, the KYC details has been specifically, I think, subject to correction, that the mechanism of referring to KYC details has been appreciated in the case law of meters and instruments specifically. And also, just to what my learned friend had stated and referred to a case law of HDFC Bank versus Amit Kumar Singh, I think that judgment is very important for the perspective that the defense lawyer or the complaint lawyer has to be very particular as to how he serves the accused person, and he needs to be, because the judgment categorizes various forms of how he can trace out and how he can do service. So that mode of doing service and on what address, I think that is very critical for the aspect of the summons, and I think that judgment of 2009 has been followed up till now, and that is very important for any lawyer, just to understand how do you do service in addition to the as a last resort filing an affidavit for the service of the address of the complainant, of the accused person. Sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question is, what do we mean by material alteration in Section 138 cases?
Material alteration is provided under Section 87. It deals with the fact, if I may refer to the language of 87, because that is quite relevant. 87 says any material alteration of a negotiable instrument renders the same void as against anyone who is party thereto at the time of making such alteration and does not consent thereto unless it was made in order to carry out the common intention of the original party. So one exception is that if it was made with the common intention of the party. So this fact needs to be pointed out. And also in the second leg of the para, it says alteration by endorsee. Any such alteration, if made by an endorsee, discharges his endorser from all liability to him in respect of the consideration thereof. So this also is a a sort of window wherein the endorsee has accepted, and so in that case the material alteration, the effect of material alteration would be lessened.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mathur. Our next question is, could you tell us more about the application under section 145 clause 2, where the accused has to make an application to examine the complainant witness?
Yeah, you want to speak, Arjun?
No, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
So 145 2 application, as my learned friend pointed out, that there was the clause starts with non-obstante clause, which means that it has an overriding effect on the CRPC. My learned friend also stated that the chief examination, which in a normal which is conducted in a normal case of a criminal nature, is being done away with just to expedite the process. The 145(2) is important for the reason that Section 3 of the Evidence Act says that the manner of taking the application and the evidence come within the section 3 of the Evidence Act, which number of times the objection is being taken by the accused side that look, 145(2) the procedure is not correct, or the chief examination cannot be cannot be taken away or dispensed with. The lead case on this aspect is Supreme Court judgment of Mandavi Cooperative Bank, 2010, Volume 3, SEC 83, paragraph 18 to 20, which says that the 145(2) stage is important for the reason that if the pre-summoning evidence has taken place already, meaning thereby that the affidavit, the chief examination has been done on affidavit. So therefore the repetition again at the stage of post-summoning evidence of the complainant need not be done, and that is a common mistake which the defense side press for, that the post-summoning evidence has to be taken again and again. So I think that is an important point. And also the stage of invoking 145(2) strictly on the lines of summary trial procedure is on the second date when the accused is summoned. There and then, after entering the plea of defense under section 263 G and H, and court giving a finding that the plea of defense is fine, the court has to pass a speaking order stating very clearly why this application of the accused for recall of the complainant is to be allowed, for the reason that this application, if the application is allowed, then the summons trial, the summary trial procedure is converted into a summons trial procedure, which is a deviation from the normal procedure. And also the court has to give a finding that why there are reasons for the court to try the case, and the punishment in the said case needs to be beyond 1 year, because the maximum sentence in a summary trial procedure is 1 year. So he has to give specific reasons. More often than not in the trial court, this specific reason for this deviation from summary trial to summons trial procedure is not specifically mentioned in the order passed by the MM under 145.
Mr. Diwan, would you like to add something?
Yeah, if I may add to the query was regarding the 145 to an application of 145. See, the application of 145(2) is required for you to cross-examination for the evidence that is of the complainant which is happening in your absence. That is the pre-summoning state, essentially. Now, The reason why the court has introduced this provision is that in an event you don't choose to file, the legislature has introduced it, is in an event you don't file an application under 145(2). What happens is straight after the notice is framed under 251 or the plea is recorded in 263, you actually directly go to defense evidence to prove your case. So every trial has two aspects of it. One is that you cross-examine, you can dislodge your case against you by cross-examination as well as by leading affirmative evidence. If you are a person or a defense which is premised on leading affirmative evidence only and no requirement of a cross-examination, if you skip the application, you can still disprove the case by going to the defense evidence. But ideally, it is very important. It is quite difficult to go straight to the defense without actually cross-examining the complainant on a practical side of how actually we have to conduct a trial. Also, I would advise that if someone's filing an application under 145(2), a right to cross-examination has been recognized as to be unhindered. Once your application is on record, more or less that right will be allowed to you. Yes, there are judgments to curtail how much of that right will be exercised in the manner it will be exercised, but the right exists so far. So once you file an application, ideally I would advise someone to file an application with very limited pleadings as to the nature of the cross-examination they're going to be conducted. Because if you do so, you'll be actually giving a little bit of a heads up to the complainant witness as to what is the line of cross-examination that you plan to do.
And just to add up, my learned friend has also done a matter in which he had taken a plea wherein the plea of defense which the accused has taken under the notice of 251, the extent of the cross-examination can be curtailed in view of that judgment. I think the name my learned friend can mention just for the clarification.
Judgment is by judgment. Justice I.S. Mehta. I will just give the name of the judgment. It actually is quite a stellar judgment because it actually tells you to curtail your cross-examination only to the plea of your defense and not unwarranted, unending cross-examination to the case. I'll give you the name of the judgment. It must be somewhere. I'll have it.
Sure, Mr. Dewan, you can just share it with us. The next question that we have is, do you think there should be a mechanism to allow the magistrate to cancel the proclaimed offender proceedings like cancellation of bailable warrant and non-bailable warrant instead of the current regime where the only remedy is filing a petition under section 397 or 401 or 482 in exceptional cases? Do you think this will expedite or delay the process of disposal of the complaint?
In my opinion, and if I may go first, Rajat, in my opinion, the magistrate should not be ideally allowed to go back on the proclaimed offender. And I'll give you the reason why. As though whoever has pointed out this query is a very pertinent query and it's not really come up for consideration much before. But the jurisdiction of a magistrate is a very final jurisdiction. It does not review its own orders. It does not touch its orders already passed. Now, warrants are issued for the purposes of appearances only, right? So to secure a person to be appearing, I issue a warrant, and in a given circumstances, as the magistrate deems fit, he may cancel the warrant considering your presence was required and for reasons beyond your control, you could not have appeared. So there is a reason why the cancellation exists. Proclaimed offender is a person or a proclaimed person in a given, I think in a 138 will be proclaimed person, will be a person who, as per law, has been duly served, has chosen not to participate in proceedings, and now wants to reopen the proceedings right from that particular stage by going back in time, if I could say so, and multiple steps back. Now, for a magistrate who has actually dealt with that situation, declared him as a proclaimed person and offender, according to me, that as in today's scheme of CRPC exists, he should not be permitted to go back on that finding and proceed towards ensuring the consequences that may ensue for being a proclaimed person. Otherwise, what will happen at the magisterial level is once you're a proclaimed person, you come back to a court and you're spending a year's time to actually fight the status of yours, whether it has to be proclaimed person or an accused otherwise, rather than actually proceeding with the trial. So I would like the magisterial court to proceed with the trial, and wherever the remedy lies against for if there is a wrongful proclamation issue, then that proclamation will be set aside with no consequences on your property or otherwise.
Yeah, just to add what he said, 2 points. One, I think the cancellation of the proceedings of the proclaimed offender, can be looked at from the point of view of the foremost policy aspect of the Negotiable Instruments Act, which is the compensatory aspect and not the punitive aspect. Second, what my learned friend just referred, I think there is one judgment of Delhi High Court which I could find on this aspect is 2012 case law of Manish Ghumar versus State, wherein Justice Mukta Gupta and the counsel was Siddharth Agarwal. The citation is Manu/DE/0079/2012, which dealt with the aspect of cancellation of the bailable warrant and also the proclaimed offender after the person made the payment, and he came to the High Court for the questioning of the proclaimed offender on the plea that look, I have made the payment and now the proceedings should come to an end. So I think one of the judgment I could find on the point my learned friend referred of Delhi High Court.
Thank you so much. The next question, we actually have a situation here and the participant wants your view on it. So the situation is, if the check without date was drawn by the accused in 2014 in favor of the complainant, the date was incorporated by complainant in 2019 and the check bounced, and the case has already been instituted in the court. The participant wants to know whether this is a good case to proceed.
If I may add, if the liability exists on the date of dishonor of the check, it is good enough according to me. There is no bar to say as to when that check should be filled. Now there is one aspect to it. If the liability by limitation law ceased to have existed or ceased to have operate, then merely presenting a check for a liability which is otherwise barred by law, you will not be able to prosecute. You will be able to only prosecute on the date the liability continued to exist. For example, I don't know what the particular case is, but to put my point more clearly, for example, I promise someone of executing X work for him and I give him a check that I will execute it as this is my security for that purpose. That execution of the work may be a long work and it got completed only or was relevant even 5 years later. The liability will be existed. But for example, that money which was due in 2014 got by law the limitation extinguished and it became 2017 or 18 by law of limitation that money stopped to be recoverable or be a legal liability as we can see it under section 130.
Just to add 2 points. Firstly, I think what my learned friend referred also can be supplemented on the fact that the law on the aspect of the security check or post dated checks needs to be seen from the perspective that when the liability was existing on the date of presentation of the check. So that is the checkpoint wherein the accused person needs to see from that perspective while defending such a case. Secondly, the accused can also take a plea on the factum of the sequence of the checks which was issued to the complainant in 2014, and when he presents the check in 2019, I think he can take a plea probably considering the overall facts of the case that the sequence of the check shows that the check was of 2014, subject to the fact that he satisfies the case that the liability does not exist in 2019.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Mathur, there's one question directed to you.
Yeah.
You mentioned few cases in your session.
Yeah.
Participant wants to know, could you give the citation of those cases if it's readily available?
I referred to the to start with I referred to the case of Damodar S. Prabhu. The citation is 2010 volume 5 SCC 663 para 467 18 19 25. The second citation I referred was meters and instruments. That citation I probably gave earlier also, but I'm giving now again. 2018 volume 1 SCC 560. And the third one I refer to Indian Bank Association case that also I gave, but 2014 5 SCC 590. And I guess rest I all the citation I all specified. These were the ones I think I left out.
Yes, Mr. Mathur, you had shared the citations. Yeah. Thank you so much. One question is, can section 138 case be settled? If yes, under what law or provision?
Arjun can go ahead with that because he's dealt that aspect.
Yeah, so 138 can be settled because it's a compoundable offense. As I pointed out in the 2000 amendment, section 147 was brought in. And section 147 says, notwithstanding anything contained in the CRPC, every offense punishable under the Negotiable Instrument Act, which includes the offense of check dishonor under 138, would be compoundable. And even this coupled with the judgment of the Supreme Court in Damodar S. Prabhu, and followed by Dayavati judgment of our own Delhi High Court, which was dealt with at great length as to how we can adopt an alternative dispute resolution mechanism, even Lok Adalat, and try to resolve as many cases. Of course, it can be settled, and Supreme Court has said as long as we settle in the first or 2 dates, with their intent being specified right at the threshold, there is unlikelihood of there should be hardly any cost being imposed.
Yeah, just to add to what he said, I think the main interpretation, how I understand, is which lent in favor of the compounding was that the expression used under 143A as far as may be, which means that the role of CRPC can be applied to Negotiable Instruments Act as far as may be required. And so therefore a situation, a small window was opened up for disposing of oblique discharge of the cases wherein the cases have been compound. So that may happen before a summons, after summons, before discharge, after a discharge. So this window was only open, and in all the cases, the once notice has been framed strictly in terms of the summary trial procedure, the cases cannot be, the person cannot be discharged except by compounding.
Thank you so much. One last question that we have is, of late we have witnessed Indian judiciary embracing technology at every step. So do you think technology, artificial intelligence in any way can be used to reduce the time in Section 138 cases?
Arjun can take in because he dealt with that aspect.
So difficult for me, I'm no tech literate to actually give a great view of this. But having said that, as pointed out, there can be great infrastructure being put into courts to digitize their material in order to facilitate a faster system, and as well as a centralized, I don't know, whatever you may call it, a software or now maybe developed for the purposes of service and the procedure where any litigant or as well as a lawyer can actually access it and know in real time as to what's happening with this case and what's happening, where is the process lagging, where is the service happening. So appropriate steps can be taken without actually requiring physical intervention in courts or trying to chase in the branches and having a real-time knowledge about your case or the status of the movement of the case.
I think my learned friend has raised a very important point in the sense that the service of the summons can be expedited through online mechanism, wherein the summons from the court branch are being directly sent to a dedicated process serving branch, and which may be supervised by any level of reasonable police officer, and the same mechanism can be followed back in the reverse sense, in the sense when the summons are being issued or the person has been served properly, the same information can be sent back to the court to the concerned person. I think the physical presence can be dispensed with, and I think that will go a long way.
Thank you for this suggestion. I think that would be very helpful. Looks like we have covered all the questions. Is there anything else that you would like to add, Mr. Mathur and Mr. Dewan, before we wrap up?
I think the recent circular of the Government of India of the Ministry of Finance to decriminalize 138 would not serve any purpose, because by this way we would go back to the status quo situation wherein the civil liability, civil offense of the act of dishonor was not suffice. And I think by making proper mechanism to expedite the cases of Negotiable Instruments Act under this act, needs to be addressed on a serious note. and by as also pointed out, various roadblocks as suggested by Mr. Diwan on the aspect of summons and the appearance of the accused. And I think if the correct legal interpretation and the correct the trial procedure minus the High Court remedy, can be adhered to, I think we can have a meaningful solution to this. And I think decriminalizing will not be a suitable thing to do.
It just may add one little thing to what Mr. Mathur said. The idea of decriminalization, as we already discussed, is not the most practice, in our opinion. And bar councils are already opposing it, as far as I understand. What I would just like to close it by saying is that it's easy for us to blame the system, the judiciary and the legislature, to cause this, where we are in the mess today, or rather a pandemic of its own sorts in the judicial system. Negotiable instruments, check this on the cases. What we can do least is, as being a stakeholder, as lawyers, try to ensure that we ourselves don't clog the system. Because to be honest, we are also quite equally responsible to clog the system.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Mathur and Mr. Diwan. It was indeed an insightful session, and it was an honor to have you both. I would also like to thank everyone for participating in today's Legit class. We hope to see you again next time. For recording of this Legit class, kindly subscribe to Legit Quest YouTube channel. Thank you all and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.